He found her in the barn, folded over the loft beam where old sacks of oats had tumbled, and a gust of wind had scattered pale straw like spilled teeth. The night had been eating itself with snow. The world outside the barn was all white and hard, but inside the air smelled of horses and stale hay, of an old lantern half used and the iron tang of sweat. Her hair was laced with frost along the parting. Her hands were clenched as if to shield something warm beneath her coat. For a breath that was too long, Elijah Garret thought she was a statue left by some cruel winter god. The light from his lantern trembled when he lifted her. It caught on the curve of her cheek and on the familiar shape of a belly pressed tight beneath a threadbare blanket. She did not answer his voice. The breath he listened for would not come. Elijah's hand, thick and steady from years of working and of killing, went to the back of her neck. It came away cold, like river stones. He tasted the metallic edge of fear. Years had carved hollows into him since Martha's fever took her 4 months before. Grief had settled into his bones like winter, precise and unyielding. He'd been living under a layer of denial since then, moving through chores as a man moves through a dream. The idea of more responsibility sat in his chest like a bullet he refused to pull out, and yet the sight of the woman's hands protecting that small warm weight, some animal instinct in him would not let him leave her in the dark. He did the only thing he had left that felt honest. He carried her, stumbling through the snow, past the sagging fence and the sleeping horses, across the yard to the cabin where the children were wrapped in quilts and the single lamp fought the dark. Lou opened the door before Elijah could rattle the latch. The 8-year-old stood in the doorway with her hair undone, her small, sharp face lit by equal parts fear and that old Martha promise. Martha's handwriting folded in the pocket of Elijah's coat, the promise to keep him from shutting life out. Lou had read the letter more times than anyone should read a wound. She had learned to take a promise like a seed and press it between her palms until it sprouted belief. "Please," she whispered when she saw the woman, and the word was less instruction than offering. They laid Anna. Elijah's mind supplied that name without thought. He liked Anna, short and plain, like a knot tied tight, on the floor before the hearth. Cold bit them all in the face. Elijah moved with a soldier's efficiency, blankets, warm water in a basin, the lamp turned nearer, fingers rubbing blood back into knuckles. Tommy and Charlotte hovered. The oldest boy's eyes were wide and flat with the knowledge of too many things for a 6-year-old. The 4-year-old clutching a rag doll and not understanding the way the house had leaned toward sorrow all winter. Lou knelt by the woman's head and placed her small hands on Anna's chest as if the warmth would pass through bone. "Lord," she said. It was a statement and a plea marbled together. Her voice was not measured like Elijah's prayers had once been in the church before the war. It was the clumsy, bright trust of childhood. "Please," Lou said again, "send someone to help her. Please send someone. An angel, or a person, or heat, or—" Elijah had a hard mouth, and he had learned to bury the words he did not want to say. But when the child looked up at him, the look of someone who trusted a promise more than fear, he could not shut it away. He found himself speaking too, though his voice felt foreign. "Lord," he said, "if you're listening, don't let her go. If there's breath to be had, give it back. Not for me, not for the sake of the house, for the baby, for these children." It was not a polished prayer. It was ragged and honest, and the way Elijah spoke it surprised him. It carried the shape of a man who had decided, in a single stubborn moment, that he would keep living. He had spent months believing death would be a mercy. The child at his knee was planting a different kind of mercy in him. Lou closed her eyes as if she could press her palms through the thin skin between the world and whatever waited beyond. "Please, Father," she said in the voice that had become her way of saying everything, combining the quiet of her mother and the steadiness of Elijah when he let himself be that steadier man. "Please don't let her be gone." If the barn had been a tomb, then the cabin was an altar. They worked in silence that smelled of soap and iron and boiled tea. Elijah warmed cloths, fanned the candle, opened Anna's collar to try to coax warmth into her. He felt for a pulse at the wrist, and at first found only a faint tremor like a bird's wing. He counted that tremor like a prayer. Then a breath clouding the cold air. Then another, smaller and uncertain. Charlotte's hands found the hem of the blanket, and she tucked it with a clumsy tenderness that made Elijah's chest tighten. It was Lou who said, half to herself, half to the room, She wasn't breathing when you found her, Papa. Her voice steadied as she told the fact aloud, as if to create a line they could measure by. You said she didn't breathe. Elijah did not correct her. The truth of it sat in the circle of them. If he had not been there, if the storm had come down harder, if the barn had been left to itself, Anna would have been swallowed by the night. That thought left him both grateful and furious. He had been given a burden, another life to keep, and with it, a chance he had not expected to want. After a long hour of fanning and warming and watching the woman's chest rise and fall like a slow tide, a very small miracle rolled in like smoke. Anna's fingers twitched, not a full movement, only a loosened way of the hand letting go of the quilt. Elijah bent closer. Her eyes were closed, lashes crusted with frost. There was a bruise of color to the skin now where the blood had returned, a warming that felt to Elijah like the first sign of morning. Her fingers moved, Lou whispered, and in that pronouncement the room made a small sound, like a thing unlocking. The thing was not whole. The woman's lips did not yet find speech. She did not open her eyes. But life is not always a single bolt of clarity. Sometimes it stitches itself slow and silent. That night, it took the shape of a warm hand, a finger curling, and a child's prayer held in the air like a benediction. If a story of answered prayer inspires you, subscribe to follow the full tale. They laid Anna by the stove and watched as the blood chased itself back into her limbs. Elijah boiled water and brewed a bitter tea, the strong herbal sort that draws heat into the body. He wrapped more blankets around the woman's shoulders and hummed a fragment of a hymn Martha used to sing, the melody more a habit than belief now, but it steadied him. Outside, the storm continued to grind the world white. Inside, the house burned like a stubborn coal. When Anna first opened her eyes, it was as if someone had lifted a veil. Her pupils were wide and the color of a late autumn sky. She blinked away snow and pain and the dark taste of fear. Her mouth formed shapes that were almost words. She tried to draw breath and nearly had to teach her chest how to remember the act. "Where am I?" she asked finally, each word like the slow clank of a distant bell. Elijah's throat closed. "In my cabin," he said. "You're safe." She tried to push up and her face screwed with a pain that made Elijah reach to steady her. "No," she said, and there was a terrible hollow edge to the word. She, Lou corrected softly before Elijah could. "The baby?" Anna's eyes went to where Lou pointed, and in the motion her face softened into something like awe and terror braided together. She had been running. She had been hiding. Whatever named Silas did not belong to a man who used tenderness as a currency. The fear in her gaze told of muffled doors, hands that did not belong to kindness, a name said like a threat. Elijah wrapped his arm around Anna's shoulders, not knowing for certain what bound them yet, but feeling the weight of promise settle on him. "You're safe here," he said again, as if speech could anchor the truth. He did not know if the words were true beyond the walls of his little house, but he would make them true with his hands and his land, and the stubbornness of a man who had buried sorrow and refused to stay buried himself. At first, Anna would not say much. She answered in fragments. She had fled from a place west of town. She had been running for 3 days. She had kept walking because walking felt safer than stopping. She had a husband named Silas Shaw. The name came out as one word, heavy as a stone. There was a bite to it. Her lips trembled when she spoke it, and Elijah could see that the memory of him sat under her ribs like a cold coal. When she learned the children's names, she smiled weakly, and for a moment the tiredness eased from her face. She reached a tentative hand toward Tommy and Charlotte, and when they leaned in, pressed their faces to hers as if to seal them with a blessing. The children, who had learned to lock away laughter in quiet places these last months, giggled quietly as the warmth of a living hand struck them like sun. That first night, Anna slept with her head against Elijah's shoulder. Tears slid down his face in the dark, not for the acceptance of new work, but because in caring for someone else, he felt something bristle alive inside him. He had thought himself done, weary of being a father who was more clockwork than soul. But the touch of a stranger's hand on his chest made him feel something like being called back. In the morning, a letter from Martha lay folded in his coat where Lou had hidden it. Elijah had taught himself not to open it in the last few months. To hold a promise on paper was less brutal than holding it in bone. But now, with Anna breathing in his bed and the children alive and the sun glancing off the snow into the yard, he pulled the paper free. Martha's handwriting had been precise as a plow line. "Promise me, Eli," she had written, "that you will keep the house full of life. Promise me you won't let the cold take you anymore. Promise me you'll let the light in." He read the words and felt them like a pledge given anew. He folded the paper and tucked it back into his pocket as if the act could lend him courage. He rose then and carried water and wood into the house, and every small piece of ordinary labor felt less like duty and more like worship. Anna stayed by the stove most of that day. She slept between fits of shivering and woke to sip broth and watch the children. When she laughed, once a small startled sound, it was like someone striking a match in a dark room. Tommy looked up from his spoon and grinned with a completeness Elijah had not seen in months. Yet the shadow of Silas lay like a scent on the air. In the lines of Anna's shoulders there was a reluctance to trust, and in her hands the carefulness of someone who held herself like something meant to be stolen back. She kept her story in fragments, the worst of it shielded from the children's ears. "You can stay as long as you need," Elijah told her once, and the words felt braver than he expected. He felt the hunger in his chest for another person in his life, for someone to answer the hollowness he'd tended like a field. The thought of marriage had been a fierce foreign thing since Martha, but the sight of Anna tending his children with a mother's hands made a roosting feeling grow under his sternum. When the baby moved that afternoon, a tiny, impatient kick that made Anna's eyes widen and put a hand on the place where the unborn stirred, the cabin's air shifted as if a bell had rung. Elijah couldn't help the exhale that ran through him. The stir of life inside Anna was a small rebellion against the winter. It was in that stirring that he named the child before any words were breathed into the world. Hope. Names have a shape to them, and Elijah's mind found a way to let the one into the light. Word in a place like Wyoming spreads like the wind, caught on fences and barn eaves. There were neighbors who would have disapproved. This was a hard land, and there were ways to measure a man's reputation. But there were also people who remembered Elijah from before grief had hollowed him out. Ezekiel Holloway was one of those men. He lived farther down the ridge, old enough to have seen wars and floods, and the way people either hardened or healed under pressure. Ezekiel had a generosity that sometimes came clumsy. He offered a sack of flour, an extra cask of salted pork, a slow nod of admission that he would stand nearby if trouble came. He came over on the second day, his boots scuffing the snow, and brought with him more wood, and a look that said he had weighed the situation and decided that sheltering a woman fleeing abuse was the sort of thing a man ought to do. "You cannot be expected to shoulder everything alone, Elijah," he said, as if reciting a truth that had been earned by age. "We look after what belongs to the valley. She comes to you. She comes to all of us." Elijah had bristled at such speech in other times. But now, with Anna sitting by the window and watching the light break across the fields, his anger had softened into a careful resolve. "You don't have to tell me twice," he answered. "I won't walk away this time." They began to plan in small practical ways. Bread kept on the shelf, a blanket hidden in the loft for sudden nights, the children taught to keep doors latched when strangers passed. The talk was ordinary and sacred at once. For the first time in months, Elijah felt part of a shape larger than his own sorrow. Yet the night's rescue had left a remainder of dread that did not melt with the snow. Anna's story had edges that cut. She had run from a man who would not be denied what he claimed as his. Silas Shaw was a name the town's simple-minded folk cloaked in silence. People used his name like a thing best not to look at too closely, like the sink of a well that could pull you in. Rumors had trailed him, doors that slammed, women who left and never spoke of where they'd been, a temper hot as iron. Still, rumor rarely turned into action. A man with money and a low temper could go untroubled in a place that liked predictability. On the third morning, a horse's hoof sounded in the distance, one note at first, then a rhythm. A rider appeared at the edge of the hill, a man wrapped in a dark coat, hat low, face harder than the weather. For a moment Elijah thought of nothing but the shadow moving along the skyline. The rider's posture had the casual confidence of a man who expected obedience. He was not a man to pass without notice. Ezekiel watched the man from the door, his eyes narrowing. "That shouldn't be out in a storm," he said. Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew enough about the way men moved to recognize a certain arrogance in that gait. He pushed back the worry with the same stubbornness he'd used to tough out a winter. Perhaps it was only a traveler. Perhaps passing riders had business and nothing to do with Anna. The rider had the look of someone who had come to see a light. He pulled his horse up at the gate and called through the storm. "Evening!" he shouted. His voice carried in a manner that suggested he was measuring the people on the porch. "Anyone home?" Elijah kept his feet planted. The instinct to reach for his rifle took shape just beneath the surface and then dissolved into the practiced motions of a man who knew there were other ways a confrontation began. He stepped forward and said, "We are. What brings you by at this hour?" The rider's face was a map of lines. "Name's Carl Decker," he said. "I've been riding with Silas. Thought I'd see if he was around." Elijah noticed Carl Decker's hand hover near his hip, the kind of casual gesture that belonged to men who practiced authority. A chill touched Elijah's spine. There was something in Decker's eyes that made him think of wolves, polite, patient, and always listening. "Silas isn't here," Elijah answered. He kept his voice even because he wanted to keep the men who might have thought to test him from guessing how much this house had been changed by one night's mercy. "No," Decker said. He looked past Elijah at the windows where Anna sat, a gray shape against the cold. His glance was swift, calculating. "That's a shame," he said. "We've been looking for someone." Ezekiel, who had come up beside Elijah, fixed Decker with a gaze that had seen many things. "You best be riding on," he said. "This is private land." Decker's smile was thin. "I reckon it's private," he said softly. "But people tend to be charitable out here. I was just wondering if you had seen a woman, thin dark hair, been on the roads these ways. Husband about to be a fuss about it." There was a small crookedness to the way Decker said husband, a way that suggested ownership more than concern. Elijah's hand itched where he had been taught to hold a gun. He thought of Anna sleeping by the stove, of the way her fingers had twitched towards the children's hair. He thought of the promise in Martha's handwriting folded in his pocket. "No one of that description has come through," Elijah said. His voice was level, but his heart beat hard enough to sting his ears. "If you're looking for someone, you'll be told to take it up with the sheriff." Decker tipped his hat as if to the law and the wind, and for a moment it seemed like he might ride away. Then he shifted his weight in the saddle and glanced at the barn, a tiny smirk playing at his mouth like a man amused at the shape of a possibility. "Maybe I'll ask again later," he said. When he rode off, the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the snow, and the cabin felt very small and very fragile. Elijah watched the place where Decker had been standing, as if he might find tracks that told a story. The old thin part of him that had once trusted only the cold arithmetic of life, feed the animals, mend the fence, hardened. He felt the old soldier's code rise in him like a remembered stance. He would not let a man like that walk into his yard and walk out with the things he'd guarded. He would not let a man bully a woman into the dark. Anna's sleep after Decker's visit was restless. She woke with the look of someone who had dreamed of hands that stole instead of held. She refused to be left alone at the barn. She refused to let anyone go across the yard without her knowing. The children learned the rhythm of her fear and, with the unthinking generosity of children, made jokes to send it away. They taught her the silly ways of the house. Lou showed her the secret patch of ground where the first crocuses might push up when spring came, 2 months still, if the world could be patient. Anna learned the cadence of nights in the cabin, how to stoke the stove without waking the others, how to muffle a cough so it was not a summons to hard men. As the days folded, Elijah found himself moving from a ledger of chores to the small improvisational work of keeping someone alive and hopeful. He measured wood differently now, not as fuel but as currency exchanged for warmth and time. He let his hand brush Anna's as they passed each other at the stove. He cracked jokes to get him to smile. Awkward things about rusted fence wire and how winter seemed less cruel when you had someone to tell about it. Anna answered with small smiles that grew like a shy lamb learning to stand. The barn, the place of Anna's being found, became a thing he could not let be only a memory. He stood in its entrance one evening, lantern in hand, watching the sky bruise into night. The barn's loft was where he'd first seen her, where the world had felt like it could have ended as easy as straw burning. He ran his fingers over a loose board and felt for splinters. In the corner, a small piece of straw caught the light and made a golden line. He imagined, absurdly, that light pooling there, first as a ribbon, then a flood. Martha's words came back to him in the hush of the space between beats. Keep the house full of life? He spoke to the barn then, not as a man scolding a building but as one making a vow. This place will not be a place of death, he said quietly, not on my watch. In the kitchen the children lay asleep in their patches of quilts. Anna's breathing was deep and steady if still fragile. Elijah sat down with the letter in his hand and traced Martha's old script. Warmth like a soft thing rolled through him, and he felt a longing that refused to be quiet. He would be a father again not because duty demanded it, but because the house and the land and the faces around him had softened him enough to want it. He would protect Anna and the baby with the same stubbornness he'd tried to hide. There were nights when hope felt brittle, when the mere thought of Silas coming back made his hands close into fists. But those nights were countered by others, small and ordinary. Anna teaching Charlotte to braid hair, Tommy showing Anna how to clear ice off a horse's flank, Lou kneeling to say the same prayer every night, closing her eyes and asking God to send an angel or a person. Elijah had not expected that a child's prayer could slice through the hard year. He had not expected to feel hope like something that settled like dust on his shoulders. On the 5th day, Anna's condition took a turn. It was not an arrival so dramatic as the first stirrings. It was a slow assertion, color returning to cheeks, appetite easing, a laugh that lasted more than a breath. When she laughed, Elijah felt a lightness that made him almost forget the fear. He found himself arranging the barn, patching holes, turning it from a place where cold might kill to one that could shelter a young beast or store the extra sacks of grain. He liked the idea of it being a vessel for life. He began to see light not as a scarce thing, but as something that could be built. The first time Anna stood without leaning, it was as if the cabin had learned a new heartbeat. She walked to the loft and ran her fingers along the beam, where she had once been crumpled and cold. She hummed a tune Elijah could not place, and the sound filled the rafters like a small bell. For a moment, Elijah thought of the night the barn had been filled with light, how the lantern had caught on her cheek, and the warmth had returned to fingers, and he understood that some moments mark a threshold. He had crossed one. He had been pulled from the edge not by mercy alone, but by the mingling of prayer and hands, by a child's insistence and a neighbor's presence and his own thin, stubborn refusal to let everything die. But the horizon kept its shape. Men like Silas did not always stay away because a house had become kind. Decker's visit had been a warning, not a promise. In the days that followed, Elijah mounted watch at dusk, and Ezekiel and other neighbors, Jacob Miller among them, and a half-dozen others, kept their eyes on the lanes and the rise of the land. The town's sheriff moved slowly, tied by law and by the inertia of small place customs. It would take something more than quiet complaints to bring a man like Silas low. Elijah knew that. He also knew the truth that modern lights and law could not deny. When a body is threatened, sometimes a community must act as one. He had seen the outlines of that kind of action in the way neighbors carried their burdens together after storms, after fires. He had learned to accept assistance from men who asked nothing in return, but the right to stand with him when a man came to take what did not belong to him. The days folded like a map, each one bearing small cartographies of recovery. Anna moved through them like someone relearning a language. The baby kicked and turned and named itself Hope 100 times over in the hopeful mouths of the children. Lou prayed at dawn and dusk, a little ritual that Elijah's soul came to rely on. He could not explain why a child's 2-word prayer, "Please, Father," seemed to push against the world and make it shift. He only knew that the barn, once a place of near death, now held a different light. It found its way into the corners, into the rusted nails and the hay bales, and even in the small human kindness of an old man bringing a sack of flour. Yet beneath the light there remained a shadow like a seam in cloth. The coming of Decker had not been a single footstep, but a door left cracked. Elijah kept watch with the patience of a man who knows storms return. He watched the ridges and the road like a shepherd. He made his decisions not from bravado, but from the fierce domestic love that had taken root despite himself. He would protect this woman and the child and his own, even if doing so required him to be someone he had for a time refused to be. On a night when the moon was thin and high, a knock came at the door that sounded like doubts made audible. The children stirred in their sleep. Anna sat up in bed, eyes wide and unafraid now, in a way that had not been there before. There was a voice outside, low, impatient, the sort that could make a man feel like he ought to step aside for no reason but the weight of another's demand. Elijah stood, the letter in his pocket, the taste of prayers and coal still warm in his mouth. He crossed the floor and opened the door. The world outside was a line of gray and snow. The man who stood there had come back. Carl Decker did not ride alone this time. The second horse carried a shadow as well, someone who moved like a creak in a house, silent and patient until you realized you were no longer alone. Decker's expression had a new edge. He looked pleased in a way that made Elijah's skin crawl. "Back again," Decker said. "Thought I'd make certain folks are keeping good company." Elijah's hand tightened at the door. He did what he always did and offered the polite thing before the violent. "If you have business, say it plain." Decker's smile was thin as a wire. "Business is simple," he said. "Silas wants to bring his wife home. He won't make a scene. He means to take her quietly." The words cut like a blade. For a breath, Elijah's world narrowed to the cabin and the bed and the 2 breaths he had been entrusted to keep safe. Anna came to the doorway then, her face pale but set with a new strength. "You will not take me," she said, and the sound of it carried something like an oath. Decker's eyes slid to hers and then back to Elijah as if measuring the house's worth. "Then you'll have proof of the trouble you've caused," he said. Elijah's answer rose slow and sure. "She is under my roof," he said. "You can ride away, or you can stay and speak to Ezekiel." Decker's laugh was a small, dry thing. "Ezekiel's a soft old fool," he said. "Silas will have his way." Elijah felt the line of him harden. He had spent months letting the world pass because it had seemed easier to be a ghost in a town full of living men. But he had a family now that felt like a life worth defending. He had a woman who had been given back to him by hands and prayers, and a child growing inside her who had already been named by his mind. He had a promise in a letter from a woman who had taught him to love. "No," Elijah said. "You go back and tell your employer that this house will stand between him and the harm he thinks he can lay on us. If he comes here with men, then he'll meet more folk than he expects." Decker's smile thinned further. "So be it," he said, and in his eyes there was a slow, dangerous calculation. "We'll be seeing you, Garret." The men rode off into the night, and the wind swallowed the sound of their departure like a mouth. The door of the cabin shut with a finality that made the house feel like a vault. Inside, someone began to cry, a small relieved sound that rose from the children, from Anna, from Elijah. It was a cry made of fear and triumph braided together. Elijah sat then, the letter heavy, and Luke's prayer still playing in the air like a hymn. He had been called back from the edge by a stranger and a child and a stack of old promises. He knew that the danger was not past, only postponed. The next days would demand courage and the slow, stubborn work of a community. The thought did not frighten him as much as it might once have. There was a reserve of something in him, hope perhaps, that had been refilled. As snow began to fall anew on the ridge, Elijah took Anna's hand. Her fingers were warm now, and inside the slow movement of the house something like a contract was being written. They would keep each other. They would keep these children. They would stand against the kind of man who believed he could seize what belonged to another. Outside, the land lay pale and waiting. Inside, a lamp flickered, and the barn's shadow receded, giving way to the idea of a place that could be full of light. Inside, a lamp trembled and the barn's shadow receded, giving way to the idea of a place that could be full of light. Days folded into one another after that. Small errands, careful repairs, wood stacked higher at the door, and with each of them the household learned the rhythm of keeping a life safe. But life is never only the sound of steady work. It also bends towards seasons of reckoning. Summer in that high valley did not arrive with gentleness. It pressed itself into the year like a hand demanding payment. Grass sprouted and water ran, but the old dangers that had cast their shadows across Anna's memory did not melt with the snow. Carl Decker's visit was the first thin note of a song that would not stay silent. The sheriff's slow steps would come later. For now, there was the immediate thing of a woman's labor gathering like weather, and the house's small, urgent economy of hands. It began without ceremony. A groan, then a tightening, then Anna's face, white, fierce, so unlike the fragile woman who had at first opened her eyes as if seeing day for the first time, became a map of concentration. The children were sent to the back room under obedient, shaky orders. Ezekiel arrived as if he had been waiting, which was true in a way. He came at a call that summed up all he believed about neighborliness. Jacob Miller and his wife Mary came as well, bringing hot water and a linen of the sort that had dried on the line in every spring for 40 years. Elijah moved like a man who had been called from 2 lives into one. His hands, used to mending fence and suturing broken harnesses, learned a new, softer work. He boiled water, he held cups, he fetched cloth. He paced the threshold and then came to stand beside Anna, gripping her hand like an anchor. When doubt prickled his skin, he thought of the letter folded in his pocket and of Martha's small insistence that he keep the house full of life. It steadied him in a way no sermon had since the war, an ordinary, simple vow that now carried others with it. Lou sat on the floor by the stove, her knees tucked beneath her, her breath coming in the slow cadence of a child who prayed by habit and by hope. She held Anna's other hand with the absolute trust of someone who believed a promise could move mountains. "Lord," she said, soft and sure, "bring strength, bring the baby, please let this one be safe." There is a small sacred choreography in a birth. The way the room hushes, the way people's voices fall into low practical tones, the way pain and grace share a single breath. Mary Miller braided a thin strip of cloth and tied it gently around Anna's wrist, as if to stitch good fortune into the skin. Ezekiel hummed a hymn his mother had taught him. He hummed it not as prayer that commanded the world, but as a kind of presence that steadied the air. When the first urgent cry came, a sound so piercing and immediate that it made the lamp gutter, the house answered. Tommy and Charlotte pressed their faces to the new thing as if to look at a miracle. For a breath, Elijah felt the world tilt in a single direction and then right itself. The infant, a small red fist of noise and appetite, drew a ragged breath and then another. Lou, entirely undone, laughed then sobbed, and her prayer poured out around the sound. Elijah found himself crying too, the way men who have been scared into softness do. Quick, startled tears that feel like an admission. He lifted the baby to Anna's chest, and there, skin on skin, the small creature calmed into a rhythm that made the cabin's walls feel like a cradle. Anna rested her forehead against the child and whispered a name that had been growing in the house for a long time. "Hope," she said, and the words stuck in everyone's mouths like a promise. The birthing was not without terror. There were moments when Anna's breath came sharp and thin. There were times when a color drained from her face and the room held more than its share of held air. But hands kept coming. Ezekiel's firm, used to hauling men from ditches. Mary's sure fingers. Elijah's own, clumsy with tenderness. Lou prayed with the single-mindedness of a child kneeling at the edge of something immense. Elijah's prayers came as half-whispered promises, as if bargaining with God for what they had been given to guard. When the child finally settled into the slow business of being fed, the house exhaled. That exhale felt like a treaty made with the world. Hope's first small chest rose and fell, and, in that movement, the house felt less like a shelter for sorrow, and more like a place where life could gather and multiply. Anna's face, as she looked down, carried the wild mix of terror and wonder that births bring. She pressed the infant close, as if to hold time itself from running away. Outside, the wind cut the valley in ribbons. Inside, a lamp burned low and steady. The barn, the place where Anna had been found, where a lantern had first caught on her cheek, and where Lou had first knelt to pray, felt less like a scar and more like a landscape of possibility. People began to bring food, and neighbors came and stood at a distance, shy with the mixture of curiosity and respect that small towns nurture. Life proliferated in small acts. A loaf of bread passed over a fence, an extra blanket left on the porch, a bucket of water fetched at midday. The baby's name passed from mouth to mouth. Hope, it stuck. It was in those weeks, with the newborn at the center of the little orbit, that the darker shape of the valley returned to make its claim. Silas did not come like a sudden thunderbolt. Men like him move with a slow, possessive tide. He calculated his returns, arranged his inward storms, and he had a way of making people feel watched. There were nights when Elijah would catch himself waiting for a hoof to break the dark, for the figure he had learned to dread to step into the lane. He refused to wait with the passivity of the man he had been before Anna came. He organized watch in small groups, a rotation that sounded childish but was the sort of thing a community does when it decides something matters more than alone. The man who proved decisive in the valley's change of course was not the sheriff at first, but Col Decker, that thin, patient rider who had once lingered at Elijah's gate like a question. Men are complicated in the ways they choose. They can be coward and conscience at the same time. Decker came back to the cabin on a gray afternoon with his shoulders rolled forward and his hat in his hands, and there was a confession on his face he had no right to keep bottled. Ezekiel met him at the threshold with a look that read a confession as kindly as a ledger. "You got your ride?" Ezekiel asked. His voice held the kind of warmth that could make a man admit fool's gold. Decker sat on the stoop and ran a gloved hand over his hair. For a long moment he did not speak. When he did, his voice was narrow but steady. "I rode for Silas a long time," he said. "I thought the work was what a man does to earn his place. I came to feel like a piece of a machine. But there are things I saw. I carried notes. I opened letters. Men do terrible things when they think themselves above being stopped." Ezekiel listened like a man who had learned to wait for truth. "Names," he said finally. Decker swallowed and then said them. Women who had left in a hush and never come back. A pattern of threats that silenced tongues. He told of a ledger Silas kept, names crossed out, payments written, promises that were nothing but bondage. He told of a place on Silas's property where he'd heard cries in the night, and of how Silas dismissed them with a laugh that had no mercy in it. Decker's hands trembled as he spoke. His confession had the tang of repentance rather than bravado. Ezekiel did what men who have spent decades in a hard land do. He gathered what he needed and went to the sheriff. Sheriff Mallory was a slow-moving man with a face like folded leather. He did not leap at rumors, but he did not let crimes evaporate unexamined. He rode in with Ezekiel and Decker at his hand, and what Decker provided, names, a ledger, locations, was a beginning. Silas's arrest was not without peril. He was a man who expected to be obeyed, and quiet men in a town that liked order often sided with the loudest claim. When the sheriff and his posse arrived at Silas's place with a warrant, there was a standoff. Silas stood on his porch like someone who owned the horizon. He did not raise a gun at first. He had the artistry of menace, preferring to let the weight of his presence press on people's will. "I run my affairs as I see fit," he told the men at the gate. "You people meddle in things you do not understand." The sheriff did not speak loudly. He read the papers and read the ledger and read Silas like a man studying rotten grain. When the men moved to lift Silas's hands, it was as much the work of a community as of law. Decker watched with a pale face. There was a long, terrible stillness in the air before the law wrapped its arms about what had been hidden. Silas was taken into custody under a cold sky that matched the faces of the men who had been done wrong by him. The trials that followed were small-town spectacles heavy with sorrow. Families came forward with names and evidence, and the ledger that Decker had quietly turned in became a map of terrible choices. People watched as men and women spoke of bruises, of threats, of things done in the dark. The court, such as it was in their part of the territory, weighed testimony and paper and what the law allowed. In that place and time, justice could be both a slow thing and a harsh one. Silas was convicted on the accounts that could be proven: coercion, threats, abuse. The gavel fell like a stone. A sentence was carried out within the terms of law then in force. It was not a triumphal moment. There was no cheering in Elijah's chest, only a hollowing that felt like the loss of something that had been part of the landscape. It had to be that way. Justice carried a cost. After the conviction, some men whispered of satisfaction. Elijah felt only a complex sadness. He sat with Anna by the stove one evening after the verdict and found his hands trembling. "I don't rejoice," he said, voice small. "I only am glad this house can breathe a little easier." Anna's hand on his was warm and honest. "He was broken too," she said. "We are not meant to celebrate a broken thing's end." Elijah found himself thinking, in the quiet that followed, of Martha's letter. The promise to keep life in the house had not been a talisman to excise all pain. It had been a charge to choose life even when life meant witnessing judgment. That nuance nested in him like a seed. He had been tempted for months to make death an easy answer. Now he understood why promise and community mattered, because living asked them to protect not merely their own peace, but the vulnerable among them. Through all of this, Decker's role was complicated. He tried to make repair in the only way he felt he could, by offering more than words. He led a small party one night to a place on Silas's land where, according to his memory, he had buried small things he thought would never be found. They found a heap of items, pieces of shawls, a silver locket, a little carved toy that belonged to women long gone from the valley. The discovery corroborated testimony and sealed what the law needed. Decker's eyes did not meet Elijah's during that day. Confession had a new weight now, but the man carried it like a man who had at last decided to be accounted for. With Silas gone, the valley's shadow shortened, but did not vanish. Justice does not turn away the ache of having been harmed. It only makes the future less likely to repeat the same harm. People attended to wounds in small, persistent ways. Visits, bread, a repaired fence. The law did what law could. The community did what a community must: shelter, tend, and try to heal. In the months that followed, small seasons of ordinary mercy braided themselves into something like a new life. The barn, which once felt like a tomb, became a place of laughter again. Elijah hung a new lantern in the loft, a bright glass thing that threw its light across the bales and made them gold in the dusk. He kept a stack of blankets near the door and a little basket of care items on the bench: wax for lips, a cloth for fever, a ribbon for the children's hair. He repaired the floorboards where he had once found Anna huddled, and he named the nails he drove as though each were a small promise. There was a wedding in late autumn, not flashy but full of the sort of blessing that comes from scars healed enough to be loved. It was not a triumphal proclamation, but a careful communal covenant. Ezekiel stood in the yard and said words that were mostly about ordinary things: fidelity, work, the keeping of a home. It was not a legal requirement in the way a judge's pen could make it, but in that valley it proved the more binding because neighbors knew the faces and the stories behind the vows. The children ran in the yard with scraps of ribbon, hope at Anna's breast, and looking, somehow, like she had always been there. Elijah's grief for Martha did not vanish. He carried it like a thing with its own small place at the table. There were nights he would sit with a cup of tea and take the old letter from his pocket. He read Martha's words aloud sometimes, the same way a man might read scripture to steady himself. He did not forget what had been taken from him. He simply made room for what had been given. The house had become a ledger of losses balanced by unexpected gifts. Lou's prayers continued, not as a magic incantation, but as a way to name what the family feared and hoped. "Thank you," she would say at dusk. "Keep us from harm. Make the barn full of light." Sometimes she added the sort of child's addendum that felt like prophecy, and let Papa smile again. The way Elijah laughed now, soft, surprised, felt like evidence that the prayer had been answered in a way larger than he had asked for. There were other reckonings as well. Decker, having turned evidence into the sheriff's hands, found himself isolated at first. Men do not forgive easily, but Ezekiel, who had the stubborn generosity of older men, spoke for him. "Every man can mend himself," Ezekiel told a gathering at the store, "if he chooses." Decker answered the work he'd broken by hauling what he could for the valley, by mending fences that had been split by winter, by delivering a sack of flour anonymously now and then. It was not penance in the theatrical sense, it was daily repair. People began to nod when they saw him on the road, the kind of nod that says, "We notice you trying." As winter crept back, the family's work took on the quiet rhythm of tending. Hope learned to gurgle, and then to clutch a finger. Tommy grew taller, a shadow of a boy who would become a man with tools and patience. Charlotte found a way to swing from the barn beam that made everyone hold their breath and then laugh when she did not fall. Lou, with the solemnity of a child who has learned to cradle a miracle, remained the house's constant intercessor. Elijah's own sense of being on the earth settled into a new shape. The soldier who had once wanted to sleep forever found himself awake early to feed animals and listen to the quiet of dawn. He felt, in the daily tasks, a pleasure that had nothing to do with duty. He took Anna's hand in public without apology, and once, walking by the barn, he stopped and said out loud, for no one but the structure to hear, "You came back to me." The words were for Anna and for all that had been given back to him. A house, children, a newborn's wail, a family's laughter. He named it with a simplicity that felt close to prayer, an acknowledgement of the work God had done through small human hands and a child's pleadings. Neighbors came to share in the small harvests and in the mending of fences. Jacob Miller taught Elijah a trick for binding straw so that it lasted a season longer. Ezekiel, who kept a soft supply of stories and hot cider, became the household's elder in practice if not in law. When the children were sick, people brought herbs and tended the night vigil by the stove. The valley's life, which had once seemed brittle, gained weight. There were moments of quiet that still took Elijah by surprise. He would sit by the window with the baby on his knees and hear the wind where he had once heard only the sound of his own heavy breathing. He would open Martha's letter and read the lines as if reading them for the first time. Keep the house full of life. He had been given back more than a barn and a woman. He had been given back an appetite for living. That appetite did not erase sorrow. Sometimes he cried in the dark for a wife he had loved well enough to mourn every day. But alongside that sorrow grew a steady, fierce gladness that made him fiercely protective in ways he had refused to be before. As word spread of Silas's fall and the discovery of the ledger, people who had lived with quiet fear felt they could finally breathe. There were no grand parades. Justice in that context was the sheriff's badge and a small ledger of evidence and the way a man could no longer set his foot on another's land to take what he fancied. The law had its limitations. It could not heal every wound, but it could, in its way, remove some of the immediate threat. There were also evenings, many of them, when the house overflowed with neighbors and food and small reparations. Weddings were celebrated with hand-stacked pies and fiddles that scratched out more joy than tune. Laughter returned in a cautious, earnest way. The barn, which Elijah had once vowed would not be a place of death, became a place of dance and stacking hay, a loft for the children to play in while adults sat and talked. The light in that barn grew less metaphor and more practical. Windows cleaned, a new lamp hung, a door mended so sound would not bite through cracks. The story of Anna's return spread beyond the ridge. People stopped by the road, sometimes simply to see if the house was real. Others came to learn how to shelter the ones they could in their own lives. The thing that started as a single child's prayer became a small instruction. Keep the house full of life, and the house will keep those you love. Elijah did not become a man with no shadows. He became a man who could name them aloud and still choose the morning. In a late winter evening, when the house was quiet and the lamp burned low, and hope slept at Anna's breast, like someone guarding the small sleep of the world, Elijah knelt in the kitchen and took the letter from Martha's coat. He read it to himself and then, softly so the children would not wake, he spoke to God. Lord, he said, not with the polished cadence of a sermon, but with the ragged voice of someone who had been given back breath. I don't know how to say thank you that means anything. I only know what you have done. Thank you for sending hands where we could have had none. Thank you for Lou's foolishness that proved wiser than any of us. Keep us humble. Keep us steady. Let this house be a place where life can come and be kept safe. He did not demand or promise. He offered a prayer that held the shape of his life, the small daily covenant to protect what had been entrusted to him. In that silent room, the barn's light flickered across the back wall like a map. Time went on. Hope learned to crawl and then to walk, and with each step the house filled in size. The barn, patched and scrubbed, took on the scent of good hay rather than the metallic taste of fear. Children left handprints on the beams. Lou taught Hope to say small prayers, and sometimes they would sing a line of the hymn Ezekiel hummed on that first long night. Elijah watched them and felt again the ache of gratitude so strong he could barely hold it. Months later, when the valley had moved through some of its worst weather and the law had been allowed to do what it must, there came a small private moment that gathered everything into a single simple line. Elijah and Anna stood in the barn's entrance at dusk, a warm wind unspooling across the fields, and they watched the children play. The lantern they had hung threw a pool of light across the straw and made the faces there soft and golden. Elijah placed his hand on the splintered beam near the place where he had first found Anna bent and cold. He could feel the grain of wood under his palm and the faintness of his own scarred knuckles. He turned to Anna then, and she smiled at him. Not a smile for courtship, but the steady smile of someone who had been returned to life and had chosen to live. The night the barn filled with light, he said, his voice low and sure, was the night you came back to life. Anna's eyes met his. For a moment the past and the present braided, and the thin space between them felt luminous. We came back, she answered. All of us. They stood there a while, the barn around them full of the kind of noises that mark small survival. The cluck of a hen, the scratch of a child's boot, the rustle of a horse shaking its mane. Outside, the valley settled into its ordinary breathing. Inside, light pooled in the loft and made everything less sharp. Before the family joined the table for supper, Elijah gathered the children and the few neighbors who had come in from the cold to bring a basket of apples. Lou stood with her chin lifted, as if assessing whether the world had kept its promises. She folded her hands the way she always did, and the simplicity of her faith had become, in its way, the family's pulse. Elijah bowed his head and spoke the words he had learned in months of small mercies. "Lord," he said, "thank you for what you have done. Keep us gentle with the ones who are broken and brave enough to heal. Let our barn be a light in a world that needs it." He did not promise that prayers always moved the mountains. He did not give the listener a formula or a guarantee. He offered thanks and a pledge that where life came, they would shelter it, and where it faltered, they would try to bring it back. The table that night was full and noisy and ordinary in the best way. Hope gurgled with a spoon in her mouth, and Tommy made a poor joke about the cat's appetite that sent Charlotte into giggles. Neighbors ate and spoke of small things. A market in town, the best way to mend a harness. They spoke, too, of the loosened hold of fear. Decker sat at the edge of the room and watched the children. He did not smile freely yet, but when Hope reached one tiny hand toward him, he found himself taking it with a care that said more than any words of penance could. Outside, the night settled, and the barn's lantern held its light against the dark. Inside, Elijah sat back and let the domestic sound of the house fill him. He had come to the edge of wanting to die, and had been called back by a child's prayer, by his own stubbornness, by the hands of neighbors, by a stranger's confession, and by a woman who would not let herself be taken. If a story can be given a single line of summation, it would be an unadorned one. Lives are fragile, and sometimes they are returned when people choose to keep them. Anna had not been a miracle in the sense that the world might sell a miracle as an easy thing. She had been found with breath absent, and then, by warmed hands and urgent prayers and the hard work of people refusing to let go, she had taken a breath that became more and more steady until it could be counted as life again. The valley called that night the barn filled with light because, in that lantern glow, and in the hush of hands, heat, and prayer, something very near to death was made to live. Years later, when children came by the lane and asked to hear the story of why the barn had its bright lantern, and why the family had that particular stubborn look in their faces, Elijah would tell it simply. He would tell of a night when a child's prayer and a man's hands and a neighbor's courage braided into the saving of a life. He would tell of the sorrow that had not been undone, and of the law that had had to do its work. He would tell how they had married and how little hope had grown. He would tell how Decca, imperfect and repentant, had learned to be useful in small ways. He would tell of Lou, who kept praying in the kitchen even when she had nothing to ask but everything to be thankful for. And sometimes, when the house was empty of visitors and only the young dog stirred in its sleep, Anna and Elijah would stand in the barn and look up at the beam where a child had been found cold and broken. They would lay their hands there and remember the first breath they had heard in the cabin, and they would say nothing, because nothing needed saying beyond the sound of the barn's quiet and the deep, contented breathing of a house that had chosen to hold life. If this house of stories has left you with a small warmth, share where you watched from and who you would bring to hear a story like this. Invite someone into the knowledge that life can return when hands and prayers and neighbors will not let it go. Lord, we come with thankfulness for what has been kept. Help us to be hands for the weary, voices for the silenced, and shelter for the ones who seek refuge. Keep our barns and our hearts full of light. Amen.